Hello, my name is Aaron Sois, and today I will be doing my Theory of Knowledge oral presentation on belief in the afterlife and society. Now, the real-life situation that I identified for this was from an autobiographical memoir of the Iranian Revolution by Marjane Satrip, who is entitled The Persepolis. Now, in this book, she recounts an episode when Taliban recruiters came to an Iranian middle school and explained to them the idea of martyrdom and promised that these martyrs would be eternally rewarded with a very positive afterlife, a heaven for martyrs. And as she remembers, this radicalizes many young boys uh, into joining the Taliban, into joining the war on behalf of the Taliban, because of this very, very powerful idea of being rewarded for being a martyr. Now, the knowledge question that I identified for this was, to what extent does belief in the afterlife benefit or hinder our society? The area of knowing that I identified for this presentation was quite obviously religion, because belief in the afterlife is more or less generally considered to be a religious idea, um, and part of the religious knowledge structure. And the ways of knowing that I identified for this was faith, emotion, and reason. Faith, because uh, faith is often considered important in religious ideas, especially in something like the afterlife, uh, and is very notable because it allows somebody to think about and understand something and understand an idea with limited evidence or with limited hard reasoning about an idea or a belief. Emotion, because oftentimes, especially with thoughts about the afterlife or mortality, as many people will admit, uh, emotion and emotional response to ideas about death or these things are an important factor or an important uh, part of understanding their beliefs and the reasons why they believe these things. And then reason, finally, because it's an interesting variable, and in some versions, in some situations, belief in the afterlife comes with quite a lot of hard reasoning and understanding, and it's very important to that understanding of their belief is reason, whereas in some other situations, reason is sidelined and is secondary, sorry, to faith and emotion, and reason isn't needed, or it's not needed to understand their ideas or their beliefs. Now, the first claim that I have that I identified here is that this belief puts big picture ideas and philosophies in terms of personal gain. Now, an example that I have for this is zakat, which is one of the 5 pillars of Islam. It's the pillar in English that represents almsgiving or charity. And under this pillar, it's considered essential to be generous to the poor, to be charitable is considered an essential facet or an essential idea in being Muslim and being a good Muslim, and thus being rewarded with a positive afterlife, with going to heaven. Uh, and this example is, I think, a good way to show how belief in the afterlife can turn big ideas and philosophies that are very reason-based about charity being good and about a charitable world being preferential to a non-charitable world. And it turns those into ideas, slightly modifies them into ideas that can be understood and thought about through a more faith-based and more emotional terms. So instead of one thinking that I should be charitable because it's the right thing to do to be charitable, because I believe in being charitable, they instead are charitable because, or they can think about charity through their faith, and also because they have an emotional reaction to the idea that they would be rewarded with an afterlife if they were charitable. So this is an important example of reason-based actions being thought of or being transformed into actions that can be understood through emotion and faith. Of course, a counterclaim to this is that secular reasoning is still convincing in most calls to action. For an example, this emotional or physical fitness. There's a Mormon belief that holds that diet and exercise and clean living just generally are important to being good Mormons. Taking care of your body is an essential thing that will be assessed when being, sort of factored into who gets what sort of afterlife. It's considered that treating your body as a temple, is the common phrase, rewards you with a positive afterlife. However, quite obviously, many non-Mormons still seek physical fitness, and even religious people who hold similar values about clean living seek physical fitness for secular reasons. And it's even, with physical fitness, obviously there is an emotional side or an emotional understanding that many people feel about it, of the desire or the perceived happiness that they will receive once they become fit or once they become attractive. But there's also just the general reasoning, and even generally the personal gain. One can see the personal gain in exercise. However, this doesn't translate perfectly into all situations, like charity, which is there's really very limited personal gain, and from a secular standpoint, though there is the emotional understanding of empathy, uh, charity from a secular standpoint can feel very non-personal or very general, versus from a religious standpoint, the need to be charitable and that understanding of it can become much more personal, which I would consider to be an important emotion, especially in action building. So claim number 2 that I have is that this belief renders followers much more susceptible to manipulation. So an example of this is in the People's Temple in Jonestown, which was the site of a mass suicide where a little under 1,000 of their followers, some even children, drank Kool-Aid mixed with poison. And this is where the famous phrase "drink the Kool-Aid" comes from, actually, to signify, it's a phrase that signifies people who have become so manipulated, so under somebody else's control, that they're willing to die to follow their orders. And this, if you look at this from, and it's important to note that the promises of an afterlife is an essential tenet to more or less any cult, and even semi more mainstream religious ideas or religious sects, like the Taliban in the original example in Iran. The promise of the afterlife or specifics of the afterlife is a very important part in how they theologically manipulate somebody, or manipulate someone based on theology. And this is notable because it comes back to the ways of knowing and the ways of understanding that people use for their belief, and that uh, this belief in the afterlife can be based almost entirely, almost solely on faith and emotion. That's how they understand their belief. And of course, the important part of, the very notable part of faith is that it limits the need, or it subverts the need for reason as an explanation for actions or for ideas. And so this leaves people very, very open to manipulation, this belief being solely based on emotion and reason and faith. Sorry. Of course, a counterclaim to this is that mainstream theological claims of the afterlife are commonly very well reasoned. An example of this is that the example that I'm using is Catholic theology, though I'd say that it holds for more or less any large modern religion, is that theological claims about the afterlife and what happens there and how it happens are often studied and academically discussed to a T. There are universities, there are seminary training, there are people who spend their career and their lifetime studying theological doctrine and documents about this and discussing. And for them, reason is a very, very essential tenet in how they understand their belief and how they understand what they know about the afterlife. And emotion and faith and reason all work together, all are essential pillars in how they think about and understand their belief in the afterlife, which is an important difference, and it makes them much, much less susceptible to manipulation. And of course, because mainstream theology is the vast majority of people, that's what makes it mainstream. You could say that the vast majority of people with this belief who tie reason into their belief are much less susceptible to manipulation than most cult followers, the average cult follower. So my conclusion is that belief in the afterlife does and is very important in turning ideas that are understood primarily through emotion into ideas that can be, or not, sorry, primarily through reason into ideas that can be understood in the context of emotion and in the context of faith, or from the perspective of faith. However, it's troubling that belief in the afterlife is primarily, or it seems to only require really a faith-based understanding of it, and an emotionally based understanding of it. Reason, though it's very popular in one's understanding of the afterlife, is often sidetracked, especially complex reasoning, or can be sidetracked. It's optional. It's considered very understandable to base one's belief in the afterlife largely on, or to understand one's belief in the afterlife largely by a faith-based and an emotionally based framework of understanding. And this can leave people very open to manipulation, which is a troubling facet of this belief. And that is my TOK presentation. I'm running out of time, so I'll have to end it there.